So welcome everybody to Abraham's Whiteboard. I'm Jeremy Fricke. I'm the Education Director at Tri-Faith Initiative. And today we're going to actually be talking about some of the spiritual beings of Abrahamic traditions. We also have a guest with us today who's Ian Jones, who we're trying to figure out some technical difficulties, but hopefully he'll be able to add his 2 cents. He's a very intelligent guy. A lot to offer. Let me just get my screen shared here and we'll get started. All right. So welcome to anyone who has not been to Abraham's Whiteboard before. This is a free monthly class on a variety of different topics in religion. We've ranged from angels to different religions like Zoroastrianism to questions like what is religion and trying to go through what the answers could be. Or we even went into the history of the Mughal Empire a few months ago. So we touch on a lot of different things, but it always ends up connecting a little bit to Judaism, Christianity, and or Islam. It's important to us at Tri-Faith that we try to be equitable with content throughout the year. So not every single lesson is going to be completely equal on these 3 traditions, but we hope that over the course of the year, it feels like an equitable representation and equitable amount of learning on each topic. So I also want to draw your attention, if you did not come to our presentation 2 months ago, please check it out. We actually, although none of the content for that presentation would be required for today, we did talk about angels, and in particular, we talked about archangels and how they are viewed in these 3 particular traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Next month, we're actually going to be talking about the Baha'i faith, and it is an Abrahamic religion that has, whenever we study any religion, it can bring up questions for ourselves about, well, this religion brings up, this topic. What does this topic mean to my own, right? What does it mean to me? How do I judge myself, and my own tradition, right? And so we're going to be walking through a little bit about the history and some basics of the Baha'i faith next month. And we'll be announcing some of the future topics after that very soon. So today we're going to be talking about a few different spiritual beings. We're going to be talking, firstly, I'm going to frame some of the conversation about why some of the decisions were made today. Then we're going to talk about Jinn and angels in Islam. We'll talk a little bit about angels in Jewish mysticism, which Ian will be able to lead. And then we'll talk a little bit about biblical portrayals of angels and pop culture and memes. Now, this seems like a huge hodgepodge of topics, and it is. But this is partially because why we talk about these particular topics is that a lot of these tend to have particular interest to younger people right now. When we're talking about Abrahamic religions, the truth is that many of our religious traditions are losing members, and the younger generations are actually, they tend to be more interested in angels than many past generations have been, or other spiritual beings in the tradition. So that is part of the intention, even though it seems like such a wide array. We'll talk a little bit about why that might be, and why these little bit different approaches to Abrahamic traditions might add value to our communities. All right, so to frame today's session, and this is true for every Abraham's Whiteboard, we hope to treat people the way that they would like to be treated. So when we're talking about depictions of angels or religious figures or anything along those lines, we generally avoid pictorial depictions in Islam, and we generally are okay with pictorial depictions in Judaism and Christianity. So in the context, we will only be showing visibly figures from a Jewish or Christian perspective. This is not to emphasize one or the other. It's just intended to treat people as they would like to be treated. And so I do want to start with a question, if anyone would like to kind of think about this a little bit. How do you usually imagine angels? And try to be kind of specific. What do angels look like? What do they feel like? Do they matter to you personally? I mean, any of those types of questions.
This is Marcia.
Thank you.
And I have two different ways that I imagine angels. One is an ethereal, almost faceless being that I have personally experienced. And the other is I imagine angels as any of us that are doing God's work and using our hands and our eyes and our senses to show compassion and love to others.
Thank you. It's very beautiful. I also want to add that I see Judy added that she imagines wings. There are definitely wings involved with most depictions of angels. All right, so a lot of people imagine something that looks a little bit like this. Often the little baby with wings is often considered a cherub, although we'll actually talk about biblical cherubs a little bit later, or kind of the Christmas tree topper type of thing, often a woman with wings and white or golden flowing clothes. Now, we're going to be talking about a lot of different depictions of angels and how they might be, and really trying to deepen that beyond our kind of pop culture-y understanding around angels. So, but before we go into angels in general, we're actually going to start a little bit with the Jinn in Islam. Now, this is a concept that is a little bit special to Islam, although there are some roots that you may be able to find in Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures as well. But so when God creates, or Allah creates the various early beings, he makes angels from light, which in Arabic is nur, and that really means basically the cool light, the kind of glowing soft light, actually a little bit like Marcia talked about, at least how I imagined what Marcia was talking about. It's not an intense, painful light. It is actually the light that is kind of like the reflection of the moon, or that soft glow. Jinn are made of pure fire, which is nar. That's an intense light and an intense fire, right? It's not a bad thing. Fire is not a bad thing. It's actually a pure fire, but it isn't necessarily good either, and we'll kind of return to that in a minute. But just to give the rest of context of some of these other major beings, we have humans who are made of clay and devils who are made of impure smoke. So we have a range of different celestial beings and humans in the context of these celestial beings. But I do want to give a little more background to Jinn. We're not going to be talking about devils or demons really tonight. That may be a future class if people are interested in that. But we're going to start here. So a lot of the time people describe Jinn as demons, and that's not really accurate. Jinn actually comes from, or actually the word genie in English comes from the word jinn in Islam. Actually, jinni is how you say plural of jinn. So many jinn are jinni, and they aren't quite similar to demons in a few different ways, and we'll go through a few of them. But they are invisible. They're invisible like many of the other celestial beings, but they are able to take material forms. Often they're most associated with I mean, they can take almost any form, but they're most associated with like wild animals in particular, especially animals who are highly independent and maybe a little bit dangerous. There's always exceptions, but that's the most common view of this. But what's special about jinn in Islam is that they're actually the only creatures that also have free will. So generally, it's not understood that that animals have free will, that they actually must follow some of their natural desires. Angels do not have free will because they must obey the commands of God, as we talked about in a previous class. But jinn do have free will. And this makes them kind of special among the creatures. And so they're able to actually choose to be good or evil like humans. And they're actually able to be any religion, like in like a similar way with humans. I would like to ask, so there will be a few different scriptural passages tonight. I would love to involve other people reading other than myself. So I would like to just ask if anyone would like to read this quick passage here. This is a passage from the Quran on that's actually about jinn.
I can read it.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
It says, "Say, O prophet, it has been revealed to me that a group of jinn listened to the Quran and said to their fellow jinn, 'Indeed, we have heard a wondrous recitation. It leads to right guidance, so we believed in it, and we will never associate anyone with our Lord in worship.'"
Thank you. So, I mean, I'll ask this openly. What do you notice about this passage? What does this show about jinn? What do they have the capacity to do because of this? So they have the capacity to be religious themselves, right? This group of jinn actually admire the Quran and really appreciate it. They feel it as a good thing. There aren't a ton of figures quite like that. And that's actually true also, Ian. Sorry, I want to point that out, that shows that they have the ability to hear, that they have some senses as well. And also it shows that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that he was actually able to speak to these jinn. I also want to bring up another story about jinn because they are so they're so special in many ways. There's actually a very famous story about jinn in the story of Solomon. So Solomon in Islam is a very, very wonderful figure. and he he actually is sort of given the power to command nature or to command living things. There's some stories about how he can actually command the wind and the creatures of the earth to do things for him. And there is some overlap with this also in the Hebrew Bible, although I don't have that passage in front of me. And these stories are also kind of reflected in the Talmud. I'll just read this one really quickly. And from the Quran 27:17, and before Solomon were marshaled his hosts of jinn and men and birds, and they were all kept in order and ranks. And as many of you may or may not know, Solomon is credited with the building of the first temple in Judaism. And the tradition in Islam is that the jinn and other living things were all working together under Solomon's command to help to build that. There actually are some reflections of this in the Talmud as well, although they are there aren't very many of them, I guess. There aren't as many mentions of it in the Talmud. All right. So before we move on from Jinn, does anyone have any particular questions that they would like to know? I really wanted to make sure that people knew about Jinn because they hold a very important role in the context of spiritual beings in Islam.
I think I have a question.
Awesome.
So I was just thinking about the communication between people and jinn, since there was like some dialogue in the passage. So are jinn believed to be like to function the same way as people do, but they're just invisible, so they can like move things / take up space and hear and see and stuff, but they just can't be seen by people? Like somebody could bump into a jinn, or is it like a different kind of thing? Because I'm trying to think, it sounds like they're pretty different from how like angels kind of live in heaven but appear to people in different forms and can be seen and heard and stuff, but like go back to heaven, or demons maybe function in a pretty different way too. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
I mean, firstly, that's a great question. I only have part of those answers. In particular, the question about taking up space, I don't know that answer. But I do know that jinn can interact with the world around us, and in many ways, in similar ways to how humans do. And that jinn go through their lives too. So they actually are born and die, and they go to heaven or hell, and they choose their path in life. Again, let me see. They're not the same as humans by any means, but they have some kind of parallel lifestyle like that. So I know that only answers about half your question, but I'll actually try to look into that and send it out with the recap.
Thank you.
And I noticed a few other people mentioned that they hadn't heard of Jinn. Yeah, this is one thing that's special and very beautiful and interesting about Islam. I don't know if we have any Muslims in our audience today, but I mean, talk to someone who is Muslim, ask them about what are jinn. They'll be happy to tell you. It's nothing off the wall. It's probably, I would say that on average, Muslims know more about jinn than Christians know about angels on average. Like it's a more important daily component of life. All right. So just to remind everybody, I'm going to start depicting angels more throughout the rest of this program. Although I believe we're actually going to see, and I hope Ian's tech starts working now. But he has a lot of interesting things to say about Jewish mysticism, which was something he studied in school and has taught me a lot about too, actually. So, Ian, if you are able to get it all to work, good luck.
Is everyone able to hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. So I'm going to be presenting a little bit about angels and Jewish mysticism.
Angels and Jewish mysticism.
Sorry, I got a little bit of reverb. Are we still okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. In particular, how angels are depicted, portrayed, and their purpose in the Jewish mystic tradition of Kabbalah. And I'm not talking Madonna Kabbalah. I'm actually talking, the real stuff. So let's get that out of the way. So we're kind of going to be facing three big questions. How are angels represented? What purposes do they serve? And why are they so important in modern Jewish mysticism? So first and foremost, let's kind of ask, we already talked about how we imagine angels or how we perceive angels to look. What do we believe their purpose is probably a really good follow-up question to that. Why do angels exist? What function do they serve in God's relationship with humanity, and vice versa?
So what is the purpose of angels? Does anyone have any particular comments about that? Is there a purpose for angels?
This is Judy, and I think they have many purposes. They watch over us, they protect us, they sing when we worship, they worship with us.
Thank you. Any other?
All right.
Yeah, and I see them as guides and protectors.
All right. That's going to be a pretty common theme as we'll see here. All right, so let's move forward if that's all right. All right, so first and foremost, you're probably drawn to that interesting little tree we have on the right here. So this is called the Sephiroth. For the sake of our conversation, let's say this is a representation of the knowable aspects of God that can come forth in humans. A good example are these top two. You see Bina and Chokmah, which are understanding and wisdom, respectively. More to the point, they are God's understanding and God's wisdom and how they can be manifested through humans. It's kind of when in Kabbalah, when they discuss that humanity was made in the image of God, this is kind of what they mean. They're not talking physical, they're talking more aspect here. So humanity is capable of understanding and wisdom, along with all of these ones down below, which we really don't need to get into today. And this is kind of a representation of that. So the reason I bring this up is angels are integral to how humans interact with these aspects of God and how humans eventually can represent these aspects of God. So first and foremost, generally speaking, angels don't really have a defined physical appearance at all. As a matter of fact, they can't be physical in Kabbalistic practices. They can only manifest in the world of creation, our world, through basically air and fire and God's divine will. So along that line then, if they can't exist in the physical world, they must exist somewhere. So Kabbalah has this interesting viewpoint where there are two worlds. You have the world of formation and the world of creation. The world of creation is the world that we all reside in. It's the physical world. It's the world of the world of body, the world of basically anything that exists. Then you have the world of formation, which, for sake of argument, is basically the blueprint for the world of creation. It is considered a lesser world because things cannot actually manifest physically in it. And likewise, humans are considered a higher tier of existence compared to angels because we have three traits they do not, which is a body, free will, and a soul. Along those lines, angels in Kabbalah also tend to kind of veer towards a singular purpose. They have one purpose and they either cease to exist or they maintain that function indefinitely. Think like a computer program. One of the reasons they brought this up is in the Zohar, which is where a lot of our modern understanding of Kabbalistic viewpoints come from. It's Abraham. God sends three angels to Abraham instead of one. So the question was asked, okay, why three? And each of those angels served a different function. So therefore, they drew the conclusion that angels must have one function and one function only, at least as far as Jewish mysticism is concerned. Any questions at the moment? I know we're going to get into some pretty interesting stuff here that well, a few head scratchers are involved, I'm sure. All right, shall we move on then? All right, so, and this is actually why we bring up purpose. So you all kind of hit the nail on the head, pretty much. Angels in Jewish mysticism have two purposes specifically. They are messengers and they are guardians. And they're guardians both ways. They're not just here to protect humans, they're there to also protect divine wisdom and divine knowledge. Predominantly, when you are studying Kabbalah and going through the practices, there is this idea that you run the risk at all times of being exposed to the full glory of God. And that can be, as traditionally believed, is incredibly devastating for mortals. A good example would be Moses, right? So he climbed Mount Zion and he was permitted to see the back of God. And even that, when he came back down, showed that he had basically burned his faith. Basically, it's very, very dangerous for any mortal creature, any creature that has any capacity of evil in their hearts or sin in their hearts to be exposed to that divine essence. It tends to be very destructive. And angels are there to kind of guide us. They're filters, so to speak, in kind of going up the tree of God's knowledge, so to speak. So along those lines, to be protectors, they kind of separate people who would wish to study the knowledge and understanding and become more aware of the aspects of God that they can represent. And they protect us from aspects we are not ready to encounter yet. For example, you may have the capacity to at least be understanding, but maybe don't have the strength or the strength of spirit yet to be kind of as wise or to embrace the wisdom of God, so to speak. So they're there to protect you from harming yourself and, more to the point, tapping into knowledge that you are not ready to acquire. Think of basically knowledge is power, but if you don't know how to use that power, it can do a great deal of harm, right? The good old quote is, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You can mean to do well, but do absolute devastation in your wake of doing so. And they're kind of there to make sure that the aspects of God that we study in Kabbalah are not used in that way, on accident or on purpose. And that's kind of the last little bit here. It kind of ties in with that last little bullet point we have here. They kind of help just guide people searching for divine enlightenment to become closer to God's divine will, and kind of help them understand how to apply that knowledge that they've acquired, how to be more in the image of God in acts and whatnot. One of the best examples I've ever heard of this is Dr. Guy Madelon. he said, in essence, what you're doing when you are practicing Kabbalah is, let's say your soul is a vessel, a cup, and that cup is filled with your will, your wants, your desires. The purpose through Kabbalistic meditation and studying the aspects of God that you can manifest is to empty that cup of your wills and wants and desires and fill them with God's wills and wants and desires, so you can be a better worshiper, a better representation of God's will. Everyone with me so far? I know we're kind of dealing with some intrinsically metaphysical stuff here, kind of more theory than anything. All right. So then, why are angels so important? I mean, obviously, besides being guardians and protectors. So they're important almost at the base level of creation when it comes to a Kabbalistic viewpoint. You'll notice here that we have on the far left, we have a representation of one of the angels that Ezekiel saw, right? And don't worry, Jeremy will definitely get into this later, I promise you. And then on the far right, we have an atom, or a representation of an atom, I should say. And in the middle, we have some kind of mishmash of the two. Now, there's a reason for this. Don't worry. Next slide. So, whoop, wrong way. There we go. Thank you so much. So I draw a parallel between angels and atoms for a reason. How best to explain this? So in Kabbalah, at least according to Rabbi Ibn Israel, who unfortunately passed away last year, he had a large collection of texts that dealt with analyses of angels, what they are, how they function, and their purpose in creation. And in this analysis, he basically came to the conclusion that angels are more or less the building blocks of God's emanations, of his creations. Here. They basically form the blueprint of creation that become manifest. And it kind of works two ways. So they exist in the world of formation. So anything that God creates is forged there and then is manifested in the world of creation later. And angels are integral to that. They are kind of almost a byproduct, so to speak. They are all at once messengers of God, but also inherently they present God's creation. They're basically, to kind of go with a more scientific analysis, they're like electrons. Their purpose is to bond with other aspects of creation, shall we say, to forge more. You know how electrons bond together, atoms grow in mass, and all of a sudden you got molecules, and then you got mass, et cetera, et cetera. They basically are a channel through which God's knowledge and wisdom can come through and reach humanity, and basically allow a bridge to be accessed between humans and God, and specifically to allow humans to understand the divine aspect in themselves that they can then bring out. And it all kind of ties back to that world of creation and formation thing, right? And this is kind of where this is where things get a little bit overly complicated to a degree here. Jeremy and I were kind of discussing this, and it is a little hard to wrap our heads around, especially with this reflection bit. So God's creation is ever expanding, according to this. Like God's emanations are ever growing. Therefore, more and more angels have to be made, just by definition of how angels are described in this particular practice. And that creation isn't exclusive to God. God creates out of nothing. However, humanity can still create. The ability to create itself is considered divine. It is one of the base manifestations of divinity that humanity has in Kabbalah. and I'm not talking just building blocks. We can build computers, we can build, towers, we can all that, but it's more ideas, concepts. We have the ability to create ideas, both good and bad, from basically nothing. We speak and things occur. We speak and ideas come out. And angels are integral to that. When we do so, according to yes, I agree. Yeah. Angels are actually very important in assisting when it comes to teaching God's will. One of the, as a side note, kind of Judy's comment here, Kabbalah has the belief that without a guide, you can get lost and get into some pretty scary stuff. But neither here nor there. That's a discussion for a later time. Very interesting discussion. I've had more than a few very long and sometimes scary discussions with rabbis regarding that aspect. So the world of formation in this instance then is God and humans contribute to it into this ever-expanding creation. And that's kind of why angels are so important. They are this mirror. They're all at once this filter, this mirror, and this connector between humanity and God. And they serve that function very, very well for those who are willing to go through, for those who are willing to connect to God through them. And I think that's one of the reasons why angels might actually be showing up more and more in just these in general. Mysticism, especially with like modern New Age stuff, is a big part of kind of modern discoveries of religion. But that's more a Jeremy's court than anything. Do we have any questions? That's pretty much all I have to say. It's kind of food for thought more than anything. And I know we dealt with some pretty interesting, complex topics, and I'm sure there are many, many questions we could have that delve into all sorts of things.
Thank you. Yeah. Do we have any particular questions? There's a lot of content. I think you did a good job of explaining something very complicated. Yeah. Do we have any particular questions or thoughts that come out hearing about Ian's thoughts on Jewish mysticism and angels?
One question I have is, you gave examples from, say, the Old Testament and all. Are angels seen as working today, and are there any examples of that?
Oh, absolutely. Anytime you, as a human being, breathe life into a new idea or a new concept, Kabbalah believes that an angel is created simply through that. As we speak ideas into being, God's creation extends through us, no matter what, one way or another. And angels, therefore, as they are the building blocks of all this, are inherently doing the work channeling that idea to others into a physical sense. Say you're trying to teach a young child a lesson that they've never learned before. The lesson is old, but the message is new because the receiver of that message is new. So when you are discussing that message to that child, because it is because parents to child is a new discussion between these two individuals, an angel has been forged more or less for the purpose of relaying that information. In the world of formation, it gets kind of tricky. But the idea is that God's creation is ever expanding. I mean, think like how the universe is supposed to constantly be expanding, kind of along those lines, but in a spiritual sense. Because God's creation is ever expanding, angels are ever working. They are ever present. They are always there on a spiritual, microscopic level, if that makes any sense. Like I said, they're spiritual atoms, more or less, in this discussion, while also being what we traditionally believe them to be too. Kabbalah is very multi-layered, and the less we get into that for the sake of Jeremy's sanity at the moment, the better.
No, I mean, it could be an entire course. It's just we could talk about it a long time and never get to where we needed to be.
You're not wrong.
Thank you. That was helpful.
I hope so. I know it's a bit of a head scratcher from time to time.
Any other questions right now for Ian? Okay. Well, I have one more question, and then we'll go on a little bit. But my question is, so you say that an angel is sort of that messenger of ideas, for like, just that's the example I can grapple with the most, I think.
Okay.
So is there an angel of reception and an angel of the message, or is there one that bridges both?
There's actually some discussion about that, believe it or not. It seems like such a minute detail, but there has been a surprising amount of dialogue about this from what I've found. Some believe that the transfer of knowledge from one individual to another is the work of one angel. Some believe it's the work of three. An angel that allows one to convey the information, an angel that carries the information itself, and then one that is the receiver. Different schools of thought, different ideas. It depends on how far you want to kind of delve into or split hairs regarding definitions in this situation. Different schools of thought. It's not a point I've seen people really get into massive discussions about or massive arguments about, but some of those, well, if we say this, then it must mean this. No, it must mean this. What is the definition of a messenger ends up being the big discussion after that.
Yeah. I know the little things do matter, though. At least they can.
I mean, I agree.
Well, thank you again, Ian. And it's very, let's see, it's very possible we'll have some more questions as we go forward. So we're going to move on to our next section, which is really about the biblical portrayals of angels. Now, again, I'd like to introduce some ideas that I'm not able to go all the way through. That's just kind of my whole strategy. A lot of the time, to be completely honest, it may be frustrating, it may be motivating, but that is part of what I do. I hope to inspire you to look into some of these things yourself as well. But there is a tradition around 9 choirs of angels in Christianity, and it's been around for I think since about the 3rd or 4th century. That basically there's a lot of different spiritual beings, and actually Ian mentioned one of them, which is basically the Ophanim, or the thrones. They're called different things depending on who you talk to, but they are just one of basically these 9 choirs of angels in Christianity, who kind of make up the different kinds of angelic beings. Just as a side note, in Judaism, there are discussions about what is the sort of ranking of angels, which angels are closest to God or furthest from God, and what is their relationship with us. But that tends to be a little more of a debate. The 9 choirs of angels are pretty standard throughout most of Christianity that has some kind of appreciation for angels in this way. So these are actually very common artistic motifs, if you will. Often they will show the sort of top tiers of angels closer to the top, and the ones that are closer to humanity near the bottom. Top tiers would be the ones that are closest to God. But we'll actually talk about the 3 really main ones that are pretty highly ranked in Judaism and Christianity, and also I believe multiple of them are mentioned in Islam as well. So and I know there's going to be a lot of text on the screen here. I'd like to actually ask someone to read about half of it, and then go to another person who might read the other half, because this is actually a portrayal of the cherubim, and it's actually called the cherubs in Islam. Yes, so let's start with that. I know it's a lot at once, but let's do it.
I can start.
Thank you.
Ezekiel 1, 5b to 111. They had the figures of human beings. However, each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. The legs of each were fused into a single rigid leg, and the feet of each were like a single calf's foot. And their sparkle was like the luster of burnished bronze. They had human hands below their wings. The 4 of them had their faces and their wings on their 4 sides. Each one's wings touched those of the other. They did not turn when they moved. Each could move in the direction of any of its faces. Each of them had a human face at the front. Each of the 4 had the face of a lion on the right. Each of the 4 had the face of an ox on the left. And each of the 4 had the face of an eagle at the back. Such were their faces. As for their wings, they were separated. Above, each had 2 touching those of the others, while the other 2 covered its body, and each could move in the direction of any of its faces. They went wherever the Spirit impelled them to go, without turning when they moved.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the the patience with the long piece here, but it kind of completes this description. Now, just to give a little background, so first I'd like to ask a question. I'll give a little more background and hopefully might have an answer after that. But I do want to ask, what are your first thoughts when you hear something about this? I tend to hear people either really wanting to know, ooh, this is really interesting and significant, and it must have deep meaning. And then the other people who are like, wow, that's weird, and I'm just going to go to a different chapter of the Bible, maybe. So I am interested in that. Just to give a little background, this is a description of Ezekiel's basically vision of heaven. Sorry, Ian's cracking up. And Ezekiel sees a few different heavenly beings, and we'll look at a couple others too, but this one is the one that's actually the most described. Who has particular thoughts about this? Is it interesting? What does it make you think of? What do you see in this? Yeah, is it Jean?
Jeannie.
Jeannie.
I'm a member of First Plymouth Church in Lincoln,
Mhm.
and our bell tower has on 4 corners faces that are supposed to represent the apostles, but the creatures and the connections and the wings of the ox and the eagle. And now I'm missing reading what the other 2 are, but those things are kind of depicted
Mhm.
in the top of our bell tower.
Yeah, and it's so people have often interpreted this in a lot of different ways, and one of the ways that people have interpreted it is through in Christianity, seeing these as representations almost of a prophecy of apostles, or a prophecy of the Gospels. Did you want to say more?
No.
Oh, okay. I see a few other chats here. All right. Yep. Ian mentions that reminds him of a chess piece on how they move. It depends on the chess piece. All right. They move like a rook or a castle. And Judy reminds her of some of the pictures on a gospel book, and as well as this kind of 4 repetition of various numbers here. Yeah, and just to be really explicit, I mean, this is a very popular thing among younger generations right now, like getting sort of looking at the Bible again and seeing like, oh, this is not what I learned about angels, has kind of brought a lot of newfound interest. And I just want to raise awareness of that. You can kind of see in the background, it's a little faded, but here is one representation where you can see the human head and the ox and the eagle and lion. I think that's a lion. And yes, so and cherubim are probably the most mentioned spiritual being other than just angels or messengers. Would anyone like to read this chapter actually from Genesis that mentions cherubim?
Before you go on to that, could I say something?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I mean, reminded me as I was reading of the Isaiah's commissioning in Isaiah chapter 6, when again he has this vision and he's asking, the question comes out, Lord, who shall I send? And he says, here I am, send me.
Yeah.
But it is again depiction of these seraphs, if you will.
And that's a different being, but we'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah, I promise you, we'll get there. No, that's a very good point, that they hold a very important role. Like they bring a lot of importance to a story when they appear, especially these particularly odd angelic beings. Thank you. Would anyone like to read this piece from Genesis? It's a little shorter. All right, well, I'll do this one. All right. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim, and he is God, with the flaming sword whirling around to guard the way to the tree of life. So what do you notice? What do you notice about the role of cherubim in this short passage here?
Sounds like they're our guardian.
All right. Yeah.
Well, they're guards.
Yeah, that's true. They're just as a side note, they are also the first divine being. At least I would argue. You could definitely make arguments. They're the first divine being beyond God, or a spiritual being beyond God that appears in the Bible, if you're going from front to back. Yeah, and there's actually, although this is not Torah study, there's a lot of depth to this passage in particular, with this whirling, flaming sword that the cherubim use to guard the way to the tree of life. That a lot of people don't remember that cherubim. So these cherubim that are described later in the Bible are actually present very early in the text too. And cherubim, again, probably show up the most of any spiritual being. I see Ali mentioned the cherubim on top of the ark in the Hebrew Bible. That's also important. They are described as being engraved on the Ark of the Covenant. They're described as being engraved onto the temple with very particular measurements. So there's a lot of depth. Yep. I think those are some great. I mean, do you wanna say that out loud, Ian? I know the tech's weird. I'm sorry.
I am back. I'm actually having a very interesting discussion with Allie in the chat. It seems that cherubim are intentionally intimidating. And they seem to be exclusively used to guard very precious things. The tree of life in this quote, Allie brought up that they're on top of the ark, and the Ark of the Covenant is very precious. And I think most of us would agree that the throne of God is also probably something that's probably worth protecting from who can say. But I know that pulling from the book of Revelations to a degree here, I remember a passage that they actually flank God's throne in that as well. So just like Jeremy said, they're kind of all over the place as very, very intimidating guards.
Yeah, for sure. And they kind of, oh, interesting. They're an impervious to fire in the garden, and from the throne in Revelations. Those are some interesting thoughts. I haven't even really thought about that one, but I think that opens up a huge discussion about why do the cherubim need to be impervious to fire, actually, and a lot of other questions come out.
So the thing about fire, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
It's not so much like, I think that it's not an imperviousness to fire so much as they are fire. They're God's like physical manifestation of force, of applying force, like weapons, basically, kind of thing.
Yeah, they are fire, is in a sense what you're saying, right? They're the
Yeah, and I mean that also goes to other terminology used for angels about light and light being linked to fire. So
yeah, it's a great point. Yep, they're very different from the kind of reflections of the Roman god Cupid as a baby that we usually have as angels, especially as cherubim. I do want to move to Ophanim really quickly here. So this is, we can, if anyone would like to read this, I would appreciate it, actually, and we'll talk about them a little bit as well. Or actually, Ian, what are you referencing with oh, that's a conversation. Forehead, why did cherubim move from being similar to how we just talked about them to being more like Roman god babies? Mostly because of my understanding is through the early Roman Empire, that's not how angelic or spiritual beings would be depicted. Those would be interpreted as the bad guys in some ways, which is our own kind of Greco-Roman bias, if you will. You don't need, like, you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of cherubim? What is the purpose of spiritual beings? What is the purpose of angels? And if you are trying to enculturate a religion, you have to kind of use some of the symbols that are used in the culture around you. So the Roman Empire had these naked babies, naked adults that were very fit humans, and mostly walked away from some of the more complex images of the divine that we see here. That's my interpretation. So in this same description of a vision of heaven, Ezekiel also sees the Ophanim. And I'll just point out a few things here so we can, because we actually learned a little bit about the Ophanim from Ian, but they are described in this way, and that's why he represented that picture and showed them in comparison to atoms, that they are very, wheelie is not the best adjective, but they have a lot of wheels. They gleam, they're shiny, they all look the same, and that there's two wheels cutting through each other, which is kind of a weird shape, but it's almost like an X made with wheels. And then they could move in any direction of its four quarters. They could not veer when moved, which basically means they couldn't turn, which again has a lot of similarities to the cherubim, who also only move with the directions. I definitely have questions about what that means, and I would love to hear more about them. But I also want to point out that they actually say that these are intended to be frightening. These are tall and frightening creatures, and not only that, but not only are they giant wheeled beings that move kind of in a weird way and are very shiny, but they also are covered with eyes. We just kind of mix in the eyes and just add more of the frighteningness. So I would like to ask the group, and firstly, if you have any other comments, feel free, but why do they need to be frightening? And why do they move the way they do? And then anyone can speak up. There isn't a right answer to these questions.
So I think that the frightening aspect could be because this way, if you don't see God as frightening in and of God isn't what's frightening. It's these tools of God. Therefore, fear isn't so much connected to God as much as love. It kind of gives a separation to that. And the weird movement thing could also be sort of to give a sense of limitation, because again, they're not God, so they have to have some kind of hard limits and limited choices, because angels are tools. They're not human beings with will to make choices, so they have very limited options, if any, then to go certain ways only.
That's a good answer. Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have any particular thoughts about either of those things? It does remind me of how most of the time in the Bible, really both in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, when angels come into play, they almost always start with fear not. And it really starts to change what you think that they're asking you to not fear anymore. Are they intended to be scary, and they must introduce themselves as, you don't need to be afraid of me. Like I'm scary. You don't need to be afraid of me. I don't know. All right. So this is a pretty popular depiction of the vision of Ezekiel. Here's another interpretation of a cherubim on the left that's glowing, and on the right we have the Ophanim, or the thrones. Sometimes they're called thrones. Yeah. So these two this is a pretty well-known piece of here. Also, was it, I can't remember who it was that mentioned this, but I think it might have been Nancy, although she left. But well, not left, but she's away for a second. First, I want to point out Ian's comment of Kabbalah presents angels are presented in a way because humans need to make them look basically familiar or like humans, but it makes the question about Ezekiel even more confusing, basically. I do want to ask anyone who would like to read this piece. This is actually the piece that is talking about the commissioning that Nancy was referring to earlier. The very popular "Here I am, send me" quote. Although I don't have it in here, it comes right after this depiction of seraphs.
So you need someone to read this page?
Yes, please.
Okay. So it's Isaiah 6:2-3. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly. And one would call to the other, "Holy, holy, holy, the Lord of hosts, his presence fills the earth." At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. "Woe to me," I cried, "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. When he touched it, he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for."
Thank you. I see you're back, Nancy. This is like the precursor to that what you were referencing earlier. So yeah, seraphs are important here. Nancy?
Yes. I was just, my pastor from Minnesota just called me. And so I was asking him about the 9 choirs of angels.
Oh, yeah. What'd he say?
He said, I'll have to look that up.
Oh, okay. You can teach him about it next time.
Right.
So I mean, I want to point out a couple things that are particular that about seraphs that are not really ever described, but the etymology of words matters. Seraph actually basically means burning one. So some relation to fire or pain or just burning, whatever that may mean. And actually, another thing that's kind of interesting about seraphim or seraph is that it's usually said to represent a venomous snake in the Hebrew text, except in a few circumstances like this one, where this is clearly an angelic being, right? There's wings, there's a process of taking away the sin of the person. I don't have the answers, but these are important to keep in the background when you're trying to understand what these angelic beings or spiritual beings do or are for. And I think Ian has an interesting question that I would love to hear any answers to, and that's basically, the tongs are kind of an interesting choice. You know, we have a spiritual being that can fly, has a whole bunch of wings, is close to God, and can take away sin of some sort, but they need tongs to pick up the burning coal. Why do you think that would be?
Do they need it for the coal, or is it kind of to keep the separation between angelic beings and people?
That's a good point too. This is what scripture studies are all about. More questions than answers usually. Yes, and also to some extent, maybe what you mentioned earlier about how they move, how cherubim and Ophanim move. This is another enforced imperfection or weakness on on an angelic being. It's something that they have to not be able to do everything. It's very interesting though. So I'm going to kind of wrap up a little bit with some references in pop culture and memes. Again, this is a wide range of topics. The intention was to sort of help people see how angelic beings are kind of becoming a more important part of especially like millennial and Gen Z culture, in ways that a lot of people don't realize. Let's see. So, and then we'll kind of end with some questions if anyone has any. But so firstly, well, this isn't first, but in angels in pop culture, all right. So there has been a huge increase of representations of angels, of spiritual beings, of various religious figures in TV series, video game series, movies, comics. I mean, I would be surprised if none of you have heard of at least one of these. Probably a couple, but I have a picture over here of the character from Avengers, Vision, who, although is never called an angel, he is kind of represented as one a little bit. He's almost a perfect being that isn't quite human. He's kind of robot / human, and it may seem kind of silly, but a lot of actually the Avengers were written by the Russo brothers. The Russo brothers, I didn't go to University of Iowa with, but they went to University of Iowa, and I went to University of Iowa, and we had the same advisor at one point, is a rabbi / Jewish professor whose name was Dr. Holstein. And he really impacted how they wrote a lot of the script and produced the actual movies of Avengers. So if you decide to really look deeply at Avengers, you might actually see a lot more religious imagery than you would have expected, in part because they were very, very influenced by him. And actually, you can find some articles online about them talking about that. We see TV series like Supernatural, Lucifer, Good Omens, Constantine. There's action ones, and there's humor, and there's drama. Video game series where you like Diablo, where you're fighting the devil with the help of angels, and many more. I just found a few that are pretty household names in a lot of families. And does anyone else know of any particular representations of angels, and especially less traditional representations of angels that they've seen recently?
I guess in the grand scheme of angels and both sides, good and bad, including like the dark angels and whatnot, like with Lucifer, I guess there's a television series that was actually produced and ran in Iran for a while. That's about a jinn, or what would be considered very similar in Christianity to a demon, that comes out and sort of gets into this guy's life and kind of tries to wreck his entire life until he finally, at the end, is able to defeat this demon and get back to normal, to react to normality. But that was an interesting thing to see from a very different perspective.
Do you know how they represented the Jinn?
Yes, in two different forms. There was a young girl, like probably early 20s, that was sort of just lost and had no memory and was abandoned and needed help. And there was also like a devious old lawyer, and it was the same Jinn in different forms, like switching back between the two.
Yeah, so that calls back to a little bit about what we talked about earlier with Jinn, and how in Islam Jinn shapeshift and they're able to take various forms and have a big enough presence to have TV series in Iran. And before we kind of end, I want to bring up memes. I mean, these are some popular memes. They're a little silly. They're a little, depending on how seriously we want to take ourselves. It might even be offensive sometimes. But they're rising in popularity. I saw that there's a Facebook group of people who just like angel memes. That's like 80,000 people. I mean, it's not a small thing. Now, as we're kind of getting closer to the end, I do want to hear, why do you think that these different images of angels, this kind of it's not even reimagining, it's actually kind of going back to more of a root of angels. Why is this appealing to people in a way that it hasn't for centuries, really?
Well, I think, sorry to kind of jump in everywhere, but I think that angels are somewhat appealing because it's outside of knowledge of our regular life. It's supernatural, so you don't have to. It can be taken. You can separate yourself from the situation that you see, but you can also connect to it, and it has the ability of like being able to have a force that is stronger than anything man-made. Doing things for you is always a comforting thought.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Ian also has posted a few other options of card games and tabletop games that reference angels. Does anyone else have any particular comments? I know, how many of you knew about the different representations of either Jinn or of like cherubim and seraphim before today? And Ian and Jason can't answer because they work with me, basically. It's cheating. Did you all know about these beings before today? Yeah. Well, good. I think part of the investment is that this is kind of leading into I'm not really sure what to call it, but basically the truth is that millennials and Gen Z tend to be anti-authoritarian, especially about religion. And I think that there's something about these new or different depictions of angels that are kind of lending themselves to that it's kind of like, you've been telling me they look this way, and they're so known in our culture, right? Everyone knows the basic concept of what an angel is, but at the same time, people are saying, well, maybe they don't, right? Maybe we should re-envision it and kind of allow some of this allow some of the supernatural back into our lives. I see a few comments in the chat as well. Yeah. So, well, I'm very glad that everyone did get to. I hope people felt like they learned something today. I do want to ask if anyone has any questions for myself, for Jason, who knows a lot, for Ian, who knows a lot. We're religion nerds, and we know a lot about this topic. Let's see. Oh, Dogma wasn't on the list, but that is another one. Miracle Workers on Hulu. Let's see. However else, there's tons. I mean, and they seem to be rising in popularity. And thank you, Nancy, for reading and adding your perspectives. Right. Hey, Ellie, are you still there? Yeah. Would you be able to post the survey?
Oh yeah, sorry, forgot about that one.
No, all good. So we would really appreciate if you would be willing to take our survey. In the recap, we'll be sending the recording, and we'll be sending the survey and some other stuff. I really do want to know, what are some things that you want to learn more about? I tend to try to find something that feels a little familiar, but we can kind of turn on its head and surprise people a little bit. But I'm happy to fulfill whatever religious literacy needs you have. Like I said, please come back next time for the Baha'i faith. And then actually the time after that, in December, we're planning to have Dr. Paul Williams talk about sort of the historical context actually of the Christmas story and the Hanukkah story. So definitely make sure you're paying attention to our website for all the new events being put up there, or Facebook, or however you get our information. And don't be afraid to let us know if you want to learn about any particular topic. I'm happy to do so. So without further ado, thank you very much. I appreciate all of you coming today and hanging out.